Hey folks, Lisa here. I am going to do today a quick sort of flip through comparison video of the Tarot in a Tin version of the Aquarian Tarot and the 1980s two-piece version of the same deck. And I'm doing this in response to an Instagram post on Kasia at Tarot Map, or her Instagram feed is Wands of Transformation. On her Instagram feed, I think it was an exchange with, I believe, with Lotus Intuitive, if I'm remembering correctly. And the question was really like, how does this compare to the vintage editions of the deck? This Tarot in a Tin version, if you own any other US game Tarot in a Tin, the format and the cardstock is the same. I think these are wonderful decks. I love their size. It's kind of like a bridge, the bridge size of a deck, a little bit narrower than a real sort of bridge or poker size. I think bridge and poker size are the same, but bigger in format than either the US game like minis, like the mini Rider-Waite, or the Los Scarabeo minis. So they're sort of a nice size. They're not so teeny tiny, but they're small. They're easy to throw into a bag, and how can you not like something in a tin? I mean, goodness. The other thing I really appreciate about the Tarot in a Tin versions, which you can get pretty easily between 15 and 18 bucks on Amazon or elsewhere, Book Depository. The cardstock is really nice, and in this deck, that's super important because when you buy the currently available standard size Aquarian Tarot, what you have is this quite plasticized. These are the Italian cardstock US games tends to these days, the image quality is fine. It doesn't have that feeling of like a facsimile of a facsimile of a facsimile, but the cardstock is the issue. When I first got these, I was like, oh, my heart sunk so deeply because I had this deck. It was one of my first decks in the late 80s, and I don't know how I lost it, but I coveted it again, and I got this version, and I was like, But now I can sort of see, for some, this it feels indestructible. That's nice. The one thing I'll say, and then I'll do the flip through, is that the vibrancy of the blue in what I call the fish scale backing for this deck, the vibrancy of the blue is really nice in the currently available standard size US Games reprinting of this deck. US Games acquired this deck, I think, in '91. It's been printed by them since then. Some of the early '90s versions of the deck, which also come in a tuck box, are pretty easy to get on eBay, and it might be that those have a better cardstock. I don't actually own one of those. If I can find a good eBay picture of that deck, I'll drop it in right here. Okay, so nice vibrant blue, yucky lamination. The quality of the image in terms of the detail, it's, I own 6 copies of this deck, I think, dating all the way back to 1970, 71. There's not much discernible difference in terms of the quality of the detail. However, the vintage decks, and you'll see this when I do the comparison, the vintage decks are not stark white. So the US game decks are stark white, and that does create a difference. Okay, let's do this walkthrough. So one of the first things to notice is when you open the Tarot in a Tin, the little white book is a fold out. It actually has the same text as the vintage little white books of this deck, which is funny because the text it really sounds outdated now. For introduction, in this age of Aquarius, the tarot cards are enjoying a revival of interest, well deserved. In 1970, referring to this Aquarian age and the well-deserved renewal of interest of the tarot, that made sense. It's really charming and sweet to read that in a 2017 little white book. But anyway, the little white book has all the same information but is a fold out. Now, in the 1980s tuck box, the little white book is also a fold out, but it's a fold out that feels more like a little white book. Okay, and it's not laminated paper, it's matte paper. Okay, so here's the box of the 1980s version of this deck, of this fish scale blue backing, printed by Morgan Press in Dobbs Ferry, New York. And let's just go through side by side. So just to start by talking about the size difference and the color difference. So this is the super laminated, readily available current version of the deck. The blue, you'll notice, is really similar to the vintage blue, right? The vintage blue, and really different from the tarot in a tin version. The tarot in a tin, like the modern, have the white borders. The size between the vintage and the modern is the same. The very rounded corners, I mean, maybe a little more rounded than we sometimes expect for this format, is the same. Now, moving to the comparison. So first of all, just noticing the ways in which the tarot in a tin, which has its skinnier, these are the Aquarian tarot in its classic format, is wider than a traditional kind of US Games standard size tarot. And so when you convert it down to the tarot in a tin kind of bridge size version, you have narrower white borders on the face cards. Also notice the difference I was talking about before between the white of the tarot in a tin and the vintage. That difference in starkness affects the way all of the colors look, but I'm particularly struck by the ways in which the kind of deep orangey kind of burnt umber, I don't even know what to call this color, that is an accent color throughout. That throughout the tarot in a tin version, like in the modern US Game version, is a much richer, it's almost a cranberry red. And there really aren't, in the vintage edition of this deck, there really aren't, the reds are all tilted toward that kind of yellow, toward orange, burnt umber. They're more in the yellow range. They don't have this kind of blue, the sort of blue qualities of the reds that we see in the modern US Game edition. So let's just go through these one by one for a little while and see where we get. One of the things about this deck is because there are no flesh tones, the colors of the faces are like the background white. You have a kind of ethereal quality that at times is quite powerful. So in the High Priestess, for instance, the little pale pink in her cheek against the white sort of offsets, I think, the sense of mystery and mystique. You can also notice how some of the orange tones we see in the vintage really do become more of a cranberry color in the modern. And with the sort of emphasis on pomegranates in the High Priestess, I think that, it works. It's just different. This is also a deck in which the kind of stateliness of the Art Deco, there's a kind of static quality to the artwork. Like the Morgan Greer tarot, this 1970s aesthetic that zooms in on the tarot images, gives us a close-up. But this deck, the close-ups also feel really static, really still. And so with a card like the Emperor, or the Hierophant, that stillness, can reflect a stance of authority. But for other cards, well, the Lovers are not a good example, but for other cards, like the Knights in this deck, the stillness is weird. I mean, it's part of the deck's aesthetic. it takes some getting used to. There's also this thing that happens in this deck with the scalloping that is used throughout, which gives this weird three-dimensionality to surfaces. So the sort of the detail, you know, at the like the breastplate for the chariot is really interesting. We see this a similar thing happen in the Temperance card. You know, so the static quality of these cards, you know, for something like Strength, the Chariot, the Emperor, the Hierophant, even for the Hermit, that stillness, I think, is really powerful. You know, and it's a stillness that, you know, in cards like the Wheel of Fortune, despite the ways in which the wheel depicts notions of movement, the stillness is something that's in the traditional iconography. You know, the sort of sense of that kind of allegorical, like these are emblems, these are symbols. You know, it's that archetypal kind of power of the static image. This deck really conveys it. And then the whiteness of the faces, you know, when you come to a card like Death, that whiteness of the faces, you know, I mean, the otherworldly quality of that. It's kind of like in the Tarot of the She when all the eyes are just white and you have that kind of ET quality. Here's that Temperance thing I was talking about with the scalloping. Let's see. The scalloping in the way that kind of creates a sense of depth, this sort of decorative this decorative detail, which actually makes it look like there's almost this three-dimensional trough in the middle of the Temperance card. So, you know, there's not a huge amount of difference in these decks in terms of, I mean, the difference in color is a subtle difference, I think. You know, the oranges are shift toward the blue. The white, the starkness of the white creates some difference. You know, you can see it here in the way that the skull in the skull face of the devil has a kind of more softening feel to it in the vintage version. But by and large, there's not a lot of difference here. Okay, so I'm just going to finish the majors and then look at a few other cards. When I get a good camera setup, which I still don't have, it'll make it easier to do flip throughs than it is right now. I feel like this is a little tedious. Here you can really feel that sort of, it's Art Deco, but almost Art Nouveau quality of the imagery. Okay, so let's look quickly at some of what I'm talking about with the ways in which the static nature of these images shift what happens here. So here's the Page of Rods, right? Staffs, wands. This is the only, I think the only figure in the deck whose eyes are obscured. And then we have the Knight of Rods. So, you know, this is the fire of the fire, right? But these knights don't have horses, and they're in profile and they're still. You know, the Queen of Rods, the King of Rods. So, you know, what's the difference between a king in this deck and a knight? The knight has his rod on his shoulder, so he's ready to work. This king's rod is his phallus is more, you know, the symbol of authority. This page, I mean, the androgyny of these images is powerful. I love it. But what do you do with a Page of Rods that's whose face is obscured exactly? What does this mean? This is part of the flavor of this deck, you know, and so then that does a kind of interesting, there's a kind of interesting quality then that happens with cards that have very different meaning but end up with really similar resonance here. So here's the Seven of Swords. Again, the close-up and the stillness of this card mean that the imagery here is not really readily discernibly different from the Ten of Rods. So is this a burden? Is this oppression? Is this, you know, is this moment in the rising of Kundalini and the rising of energy and the rising of virya, of the perfection of vigor, of zeal in a Buddhist psychology? Is the Ten of Rods is the depiction of that rising of energy, which then can come to burden us. Is that what's going on here? Is anything different going on here? How is this a different activity? How is this a card of theft, a card of stealth, a card of cunning or stratagem? How is this about the ways in which the discerning qualities of mind can bring us into situations where we're trying to cut our way through and perhaps compromising an ethical stake in the meanwhile? The static, emblematic, kind of allegorical quality of all of these cards, that Art Deco aesthetic that kind of flattens out movement. In this deck, I mean, that shifts some of the distinctions that we might see quickly in the cards. And that way in which the aesthetic flattens out movement is also, I think, as I talk about it now, is also maybe related to what I see in the scalloping that we find in Temperance and other images where you have something that is surface but now looks like depth. This is a deck that is calling into question the relationship between surface and depth, between stillness and movement. That's part of its strength, but like many things in life, strengths are often, from the flip side, also their weaknesses. But it is a fundamental character. I mean, that is the personality of the Aquarian Tarot. It's one of the things I love about it, that it has a personality, has a distinct voice. And I guess my ultimate point in this flip through is to say that that voice is carried through beautifully in the US game versions of this deck, that the Tarot in a Tin version has starker whites. It also, I should have mentioned this, you probably noticed this yourself, it also, of course, has the copyright, which the vintage editions do not. But it's carried out beautifully. The voice is heard in this US Games edition. The whites are whiter. The oranges and sort of red tones are all shifted more toward the blue. You can see that here too in the sky, in the way that this is a sort of rosier, this is a more violet version of the sky. The proportions mean that the borders look different. The backs look different. Cardstock, actually the feel of these two decks, the vintage is thicker. It's really nice. And in fact, the 1980s edition that has the blue and white, it's my favorite. The one with the fish scale backing of all the vintage editions. The fish scale 1980s version is my favorite. But this cardstock is beautiful. But this cardstock is completely acceptable. It's slicker, it's a little thinner, shuffles beautifully, wears beautifully. I guess if I had to, give a review, the Tarot in a Tin is a completely wonderful choice for this deck. If you're looking to buy the Aquarian Tarot. Okay, I hope this was useful. If there are other bits of information or other cards you want to see, you can just put a comment below and I'll either do another quick video or post something on Instagram. Okay, bye y'all.